When my husband Silas and I got married, I thought we had forever. We were inseparable partners in every sense of the word. Every decision we made, every step we took, was together. We had dreams we were working toward, small traditions that made us smile, and an unshakable trust that I thought could weather any storm. Silas wasn't just my husband, he was my best friend, my rock, my everything. Then, everything changed in an instant. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the roads glisten under streetlights, deceptively beautiful but dangerously slick. Silas was driving home late from work, something he rarely did because we always made it a point to have dinner together. I remember texting him earlier that day to say I was making his favorite meal, chicken Alfredo, and he replied with his usual playful enthusiasm, "Can't wait. Save me extra garlic bread." But that dinner never happened. Instead, I got a phone call that would change my life forever. I still remember the moment so vividly, the way the phone buzzed in my hand, the hesitant voice on the other end, and the words that didn't make sense at first. "Your husband's been in an accident. He's at County General. You should come as soon as possible." Time became a blur after that. I don't even remember how I got to the hospital. All I know is I arrived there shaking, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario. When I saw Silas lying there, unconscious, hooked up to machines that were keeping him alive, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My strong, vibrant husband looked so fragile, so lifeless. The doctors were kind but blunt. They explained the extent of his injuries, head trauma, broken ribs, internal bleeding, and what it meant for his future. "He's stable, but he's in a coma," one of them said. "We don't know when or if he'll wake up." Those words hit me like a sledgehammer. The idea that Silas might never come back to me was unbearable. I spent the next few days in the hospital, refusing to leave his side. I held his hand, talked to him, begged him to wake up, to fight his way back to me. Every beep of the monitors felt like a lifeline, and every time a nurse or doctor entered the room, I braced myself for more bad news. Our friends and family rallied around me, trying to offer support in any way they could. Some brought food, others took over chores I couldn't even think about. Everyone meant well, but it was overwhelming. I felt like I was drowning, even as they tried to throw me a lifeline. Out of everyone, it was Silas's best friend, Gael, who stood out. He was there from the moment he heard about the accident, ready to help with whatever I needed. At first, I was so grateful for his presence. Gael and Silas had been friends since college, practically brothers, and having him around felt like having a piece of Silas with me. He offered to drive me to the hospital when I was too exhausted to function and made sure I ate when I forgot. Looking back, I think I clung to that support more than I should have. At the time, I told myself it was natural he was grieving too, and we were both just trying to get through an impossible situation. But maybe there were signs even then, subtle moments when lines blurred without either of us realizing. Weeks turned into months, and the weight of everything started to crush me. Silas remained in a coma, and my life became a routine of hospital visits, whispered prayers, and sleepless nights. I was running on fumes, trying to hold it all together while the world I once knew unraveled around me. My home felt empty without Silas there. Our bed felt too big, our dinners too quiet. Even the little things like watching our favorite shows or laughing over silly inside jokes were gone, leaving a void I didn't know how to fill. That's when Gael became a constant in my life. At first, it felt like he was just being the friend I desperately needed. Gael had always been the life of the party in our friend group, the one with a quick joke or a mischievous grin, but now he showed a different side, a softer, more caring one. He would show up at the hospital with coffee and breakfast sandwiches, saying he knew I wouldn't have eaten. He stayed late some nights, sitting with me in the quiet of Silas's room, reassuring me that I wasn't alone. His presence became a comfort, and I leaned on him more and more. It started with small things. When I needed groceries but didn't have the energy, Gael offered to handle it. When the sink at home started leaking, he came over with a toolbox and fixed it without me even asking. He made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere, and at the time I was so grateful for his help that I didn't think twice about it. But it wasn't just the physical tasks Gael helped with, it was the emotional ones too. He listened when I broke down crying about how unfair it all was. about how I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going. He told me stories about Silas, funny memories from their college days, and for a moment it felt like I could breathe again. Then there were the little gestures, the ones I tried not to read too much into. The way his hand would linger on my shoulder when he hugged me goodbye. The way he'd call me at night just to make sure I was okay, even when we'd already spent the day together. The way he seemed to anticipate what I needed before I even knew myself. At first I told myself it was harmless. Gael was just a good friend, someone who cared deeply for Silas and wanted to help me through this nightmare. But deep down, I think I knew I was playing with fire. There were moments when I caught myself smiling a little too long at something he said, or when his touch sent a spark through me that I didn't want to acknowledge. I started to justify it in my mind. I was grieving, I told myself. Silas wasn't really there, and I was clinging to the only piece of stability I had left. Gael was safe, familiar, and he understood what I was going through in a way no one else could. But the truth was, I was lonely, achingly, painfully lonely. I missed Silas with every fiber of my being, but there was no one to fill the void he left behind. And Gael, whether intentionally or not, began to step into that space. I tried to convince myself that it was innocent, that I wasn't crossing any lines. But the lines were blurring, and the weight of it all was starting to feel dangerously heavy. One night I broke. It wasn't a sudden thing, it had been building for weeks, maybe months. The stress, the loneliness, the fear, it all came crashing down on me at once. I remember sitting in the living room, staring at the clock as another sleepless night passed. My thoughts were spiraling, running circles around the same unanswerable questions. What if Silas never wakes up? What if this is my life forever? What if I'm not strong enough to handle it? I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all, and I didn't know how to pull myself out. That's when Gael showed up. He'd texted earlier, asking if I needed anything, and I'd brushed him off, but he came anyway. I just had a feeling, he said when I opened the door. I didn't even have the energy to argue. He walked in with a bag of takeout, trying to make light conversation as he unpacked it on the kitchen counter. I barely said a word, my mind too clouded to focus on anything. He must have noticed because he stopped what he was doing and came to sit next to me on the couch. "Talk to me," he said softly, his voice full of concern. At first I tried to hold it in, but the dam broke and everything came pouring out. I told him how scared I was, how lost I felt, how much I missed Silas. I admitted things I hadn't even allowed myself to think about, that I wasn't sure I could keep going, that I felt like a failure for not being stronger. Gael didn't interrupt or try to offer solutions. He just listened, his expression a mix of sympathy and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. When I finally ran out of words, he pulled me into a hug. It wasn't the kind of quick, casual hug he'd given me before. It was longer, tighter, like he was trying to hold me together. And that's when it happened. One moment we were sitting there, and the next, his lips were on mine. I froze, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into it, letting myself get lost in the warmth and familiarity of it. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone, and it was intoxicating. When it was over, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a ton of bricks. I pulled back, my heart racing, and muttered something about how it was a mistake. But Gael didn't seem shocked or apologetic. Instead, he looked at me like he understood, like he'd been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. I hated myself the moment it happened. I felt like I'd betrayed Silas in the worst possible way, but I couldn't deny that I'd wanted it, even if only for a moment. I tried to convince myself that it was just a slip, a moment of weakness brought on by everything I was going through. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and confusion. I avoided Gael as much as I could, telling myself that putting distance between us would fix everything. But it wasn't that simple. He kept coming around, acting like nothing had changed, while I felt like I was living a double life. I couldn't look at Silas lying in that hospital bed without feeling like the worst person alive. My heart was torn between regret and a desperate need to feel something, anything, other than the crushing emptiness that had taken over my life. Then the unthinkable happened. Silas woke up. It wasn't dramatic or sudden like in the movies, it was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The nurses had warned me that patients in comas could sometimes show signs of awareness before fully regaining consciousness, so when Silas's fingers twitched one day as I held his hand, I thought it was just a reflex. But then it happened again, and this time his eyelids fluttered. I called for the nurse, my heart pounding as hope and fear collided inside me. What if he woke up but wasn't the same? What if he couldn't remember me? The days that followed were a blur of cautious optimism as Silas began responding to stimuli, squeezing my hand when asked, and eventually opening his eyes. The first time he looked at me, really looked at me, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. He didn't say anything, he was too weak, but I could see the recognition in his gaze, and it was like the world started spinning again after being frozen in place for so long. But as overjoyed as I was, the guilt hit me even harder. Every time Silas smiled or reached out for me, it felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. I couldn't look at him without replaying that night with Gael in my mind. The memory of what I'd done haunted me, and I started to wonder if Silas could sense it. They say you can't hide anything from someone who knows you as well as your spouse does, and Silas knew me better than anyone. Gael, on the other hand, became noticeably distant. At first I thought it was because Silas was waking up and he wanted to give us space. But then I realized it was more than that, he was avoiding me. He stopped texting as often, stopped showing up unannounced, and when he did come to the hospital, he barely stayed long enough to say hello before leaving again. I didn't know if it was guilt, fear, or both, but his absence was deafening. Part of me was relieved. Having Gael around while Silas was recovering would have been unbearable. I couldn't handle the tension, the unspoken truth hanging between us. But his sudden withdrawal also felt like abandonment. Gael had been my lifeline during the darkest moments, and now, when I needed to figure out how to move forward, he was gone. Silas's recovery was slow but steady. He started physical therapy, working tirelessly to regain his strength, and as the days turned into weeks, he began piecing together the gaps in his memory. He asked a lot of questions about the accident, about what had happened while he was unconscious, and I answered as honestly as I could. Well, almost honestly. I left out the part about Gael and me, and every time I did, I felt like I was building a house of cards, one that could collapse with the slightest gust of truth. I could tell Silas was suspicious, though. He'd notice when I flinched at certain questions or avoided saying Gael's name. He didn't push, but the way he looked at me sometimes like he was trying to read my mind made my stomach churn. I wanted to tell him, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness, but the thought of shattering his fragile happiness stopped me every time. I spent my nights lying awake, wondering if Gael would ever tell Silas the truth. A part of me almost wished he would, just to get it over with. But as the days passed and Gael stayed silent, I realized he wasn't going to say anything. He was leaving me to carry this burden alone, and maybe that was for the best. Silas didn't deserve to have his recovery overshadowed by betrayal. Still, the weight of what I'd done was suffocating. Every kind word from Silas, every touch, every smile, felt like a reminder of how much I'd let him down. I tried to bury my guilt, to focus on helping him heal, but it wasn't that simple. The past had a way of creeping back in, no matter how hard I tried to keep it at bay. Silas's recovery has been a journey of small victories and constant challenges. Every day I watch him fight to regain the life that was stolen from him in an instant. His determination amazes me. He works tirelessly in therapy, pushing through pain and frustration with a strength that leaves me in awe. I should feel nothing but pride and relief as I watch him improve, but instead I carry a crushing guilt that won't let me breathe. Every step forward he takes reminds me of how deeply I betrayed him. I've tried to bury the memory of what happened with Gael, but it lingers like a shadow I can't escape. I've convinced myself that telling Silas the truth would do more harm than good. What would it accomplish? He's been through enough, why add to his pain when it can't change the past? Still, the secret weighs on me. There are moments when I catch Silas looking at me, his gaze lingering a little too long, as if he's searching for something just below the surface. I can't help but wonder if he senses that something is wrong, if he's piecing together the cracks in the foundation of our marriage. I try to be the perfect wife now, supportive, patient, always there when he needs me, but no matter how much I do, it never feels like enough to erase what I've done. Gael, on the other hand, has completely disappeared from our lives. He hasn't visited since Silas regained consciousness, hasn't called to check in, hasn't even sent a text. At first, I thought his absence might raise questions, but Silas hasn't mentioned him much. Maybe he assumes Gael is giving us space, or maybe he's too focused on his recovery to notice. Either way, I'm relieved and resentful all at once. Part of me feels abandoned by Gael. For all the support he gave me during the hardest months of my life, he's vanished when I'm left to deal with the aftermath of what we did. I don't know if he feels guilty or if he simply doesn't want to face the consequences, but his silence feels like a punishment. And yet I know deep down that it's better this way. If Gael stayed in the picture, I don't know if I'd be able to hold it all together. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying every decision that led me here. I think about how different things could have been if I'd just been stronger, if I hadn't let my grief and loneliness cloud my judgment. I tell myself that I wasn't in my right mind, that the weight of Silas's coma pushed me into a moment of weakness, but the excuses feel hollow. At the end of the day, I made a choice, and now I have to live with it. Silas doesn't know, and maybe he never will. I've promised myself that I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to him, even if he never realizes why. I'll be the wife he deserves, the partner he can count on. Because that's all I can do now. But the guilt never really goes away. It sits in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the lines I crossed and the trust I shattered. This isn't the life I envisioned for us. I wanted a future full of love and honesty, a marriage built on unshakable trust. But I've turned that future into something fragile, something that could break if the truth ever came to light. And so I carry this secret alone, knowing that the weight of it is mine to bear. Silas is alive, and for that I'm endlessly grateful. But the person I used to be, the person he thought I was, that person is gone, and I'm not sure if I'll ever get her back.